Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so we may have gotten this far. We might have very well gotten past this in class, right? But I'm kind of just like guessing at this one a little bit, simply because we got to keep moving. Your A period, guys, y'all are going to have y'all's, or A period, y'all are going to have y'all's tests on Wednesday of next week. D and F, you're going to have yours on Thursday of next week, right? So, but I am kind of guessing at this one a little bit, so if you got a little past this, then just kind of skip ahead until you see some content that you've actually gone over. Or just listen in and get after it. It'll be a nice little review. But today we spent the bulk of class talking about the French colonies in North America, right? We talked about how South and Central America are going to be heavily colonized by the Portuguese and Spanish. All of South America is going to be colonized by the Portuguese and the Spanish. Some of Central America, parts of North America are going to be owning the Spanish as well. Well, there are two other major European countries that want to get involved in the colonization of North America, right? Their earliest settlements were mainly just small explorations. They didn't really see very much. And as we already know, French colonies remained very, very small and grew very, very slowly because it was mainly more about fur trapping. And it was mostly just a very, very big difference of method of colonization, right? Well, this is very important as well. A little note that you need to jot down. When we talked about Spanish colonialism and the mixing of races, right? We talked about mestizos and mulattoes and how that was universally accepted in the Spanish colonies, also pretty much very accepted in the French colonies as well. Something you got to understand is French and Spanish colonizers, right? The people being brought over to colonize were mostly single men. Now, maybe they were married back in Europe, but I mean they did not bring their families with them. They were men that were there trying to make gains for themselves before then heading back to Europe eventually, right? English colonies, on the other hand, were started mostly by families, right? Entire family groups moving and colonizing new areas of this North American region. So let's go ahead and get into that and talk about the English colonies, and then the English colonies will eventually expand. Now, out of all the colonies, you got to understand, or all the colonizing groups, the English had 13 of them total, right, by the time the American Revolution gets kicked off. Now, the first permanent colony that they had was in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia, right? So Jamestown, very, very important colony, started by your boy James I, James Stuart James I, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and first Scottish and English king of England, right? They were sent there by that man himself, right? Jamestown, Virginia, right? Virginia being named for, of course, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Now, the settlers would not have survived without the aid of the Native Americans, as we know, which brings about a lot of these early stories of blah 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 and yada 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 and Thanksgivings and whatnot, which gets mixed a lot with the Puritan ones. But the very first colony was in Jamestown, Virginia, and the reason why the English decided to then start trying to settle every other part of the East Coast is because they found something in Virginia that grew very well and made them so much money, which then spurred on colonization from the get-go, right? So, and that was, of course, tobacco, right? So tobacco was a major good found in Virginia. Now, you'll notice also that I said the first permanent settlement, right? As in never left, as in never went anywhere. Well, there was an earlier settlement that came before 1607 and around, I think, 1604. I think it was 1604. It was known as the Roanoke colony. Jot that down somewhere. The Roanoke colony was actually established by a guy named Sir Walter Raleigh, right? Now, the crazy thing about the Roanoke colony, and this was in North Carolina. All right, so Roanoke, North Carolina, off the coast of North Carolina. The crazy thing about the Roanoke settlement, though, is it disappeared, right? It was known as the Lost Colony, right? It disappeared because when Sir Walter Raleigh left at one point, so the colony was established by Governor Ralph Lane in 1584, all right? So it was about 1584 in North Carolina. And I thought it was 1604, but I'm about 20 years off, so it's not a big deal. But anyway, Sir Walter Raleigh, of course, made this main attempt. He goes off to go get supplies. He comes back 2 years later, colony's gone, right? So also, big thing about Jamestown, the winters were very harsh. Apparently, at one point, they turned to cannibalism before actually asking the Native Americans for help. There's this woman actually named Jamestown Jane. So she actually looks like... Where's she at? Jamestown Jane. All right, so Jamestown Jane is this woman right here. and it actually, we believe this is what she looked like, but she died in Jamestown, Virginia during one of the harsh winters before they started turning to the Native Americans for help, and we can see tool marks from where they like peeled skin off her face to eat it. Like, so the Jamestown settlers were also eating like boot leather and tree bark and all kinds of other crazy stuff. But as you can tell, the very first colonies for the English got off to a little bit of a rocky start, but with the discovery of tobacco and the aid of the Native Americans, the English were able to like prosper, right? Now, then there was a separate group of people. So the very first colony was a joint stock colony. So, over in Jamestown, put joint stock, which means it was intended to make money, right? So then you've got a religious colony. These people called Puritans, Puritan Separatists, right? Also known as what you would call the Pilgrims, are going to land in Plymouth, Massachusetts and start the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, they were English Protestants that were persecuted in England, right? Now, some of y'all immediately are probably asking, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. I thought that all the English people were Protestants by this point because the Anglican Church and Henry VIII and all that stuff, so you're counteracting, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, the Puritans are yet another Protestant, right? And they were called the Puritans because remember when we talked about like the Anglican Church and how Henry VIII made kind of a diet Catholic church, right? It still had the Eucharist and it still had a lot of the similar Catholic ideals, right? A lot of the similar the Catholic rituals, but he just wanted to separate so he could get a divorce and create his own like separate head of state and head of church position. Well, the Puritans were these Calvinists, right, that learned their ways from Calvin himself in Geneva, Switzerland, and then came back after Mary was dead. Mary, the Catholic Queen of England, was dead, and they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of all of its old Catholic elements, right? That's why they were called Puritans. But they were heavily persecuted in English. Apparently their ears would get cut off if they were too raucous and started protesting too much. They were sometimes put to death and even harmed. So Puritan Separatists, also known as the Pilgrims, because they were making a pilgrimage, would land in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And of course, as we all know, y'all seem to know about the boat that they took. The Pilgrims would survive with the aid of the Native Americans and a strong government, right? So now the Native American first Thanksgiving shenanigans with these guys that you see, like that story, and then these guys you see, is not really that accurate, right? The Native Americans heavily outnumbered the Pilgrims at the very first Thanksgiving. It was like 85% Native Americans. They didn't eat turkey. They actually probably brought deer. And the celebration was to commemorate a massacre of another huge tribe of Native Americans that had actually already occurred, right? So it's not as glitzy and coloring book as we like to think, but the Puritans did bring with them one very important thing, right? They established the very first government that existed in Northern America, right? Its own independent government. It was called the Mayflower Compact, right? This compact was an agreement that set down how to rule the colony of Plymouth. So, this is super important because it's actually starting to set up this idea of a new government in this new world and these separatists in this new world, and eventually can lead to things like revolution, American independence, and ideals of, self-determination and autonomy, right? So the Mayflower Compact is very important, all right? So this agreement was set down by those Puritans on how they were going to rule. And the English colonies would eventually keep coming, right? After the Mayflower Compact set up a very, very easy rule, and it began to prosper in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. English people would be starting to send over because they had the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then Virginia, and then they had Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Maryland was the only place safe for Catholics because it's Mary's land, founded by a guy named Lord Baltimore, right? So New York all the way down to Georgia, they're going to grow very, very fast. The southern colonies are going to grow the fastest in wealth because they begin to grow a lot of tobacco, and it also becomes a center to grow cotton as well, right? So also rice was a big thing they grew in South Carolina, oddly enough. Now, anyway, they're going to grow very, very fast. The southern ones are going to grow a lot in wealth, right? So now, governing the colonies, this is a title, very important, okay, it's a title, all right? So governing the colonies is also really important because the colonies would agree to be governed by their European founders. Governors, or these things called viceroys, all right, V-I-C-E. I don't want to roll over my cord because I'm going to end up ripping off my computer off of my thing. Viceroys, V-I-C-E-R-O-Y. Viceroys would be appointed to run the colonies and then report back to the monarchs, right? So they would divide the colonies up into little provincial states, and a viceroy or a governor was elected to run each colony and then report their findings, their wealth, their wares, their shipments, and all that stuff back to Europe, right? So at this point, we're starting to set up like this kind of global economy kind of thing, right? There's a lot of money changing hands. Europe's now taking over other parts of the world. So this is going to lead to a struggle for power, right? So like write down this as a title, right? And the biggest struggle for power that happened was actually between it was a worldwide war, actually. I'm not even going to lie to you. All right, so write like the First World War. All right, the First World War. Now, some of you are like, I thought that was in 1914. I even probably got some parents right now that are like, wait a minute. World War I was 1914 to 1918. What's this guy getting at? All right, so well, check this out. The very first worldwide war was actually the 7 Years' War. So what I want you to write down is 7 Years' War. It was mostly started over colonial claims and other lingering rivalries in Europe, right? For example, the French didn't like the Austrians, but they didn't like the Prussians more, and the French also didn't really like the British, and the British hated the French, and the French were the blah, 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 blah. So, like, a lot of European rivalries caused the 7 Years' War, and then also a lot of the colonial claims, right? Now, we're going to put a pin in the 7 Years' War, and we're going to come back to the 7 Years' War in the next unit when we talk about absolutism, which is the growing government trend that's happening in Europe during this time period, right? What we're going to talk about right now, though, is how it affected the colonies. Europeans are going to dispute over land for future colonies. The biggest one that broke out was called the French and Indian War, right? The French and Indian War was a part of the 7 Years' War, right? And it was when France and England began to battle for land in America, right? Particularly over places like Ohio and like the Mississippi River Valley, all right? So now, this is going to start as France and England began to battle for land in America. The conflict is going to spread worldwide during the 7 Years' War. Fighting is going to occur in Europe, Africa, even India, all these places where these Europeans had been going. Because remember, the Portuguese went around Africa, and then the Dutch did as well. And then the British are going to start going in and heading to Africa, and then the British are going to head to India. And then you have all these companies, these East India companies, taking everything around. This global economy and this global takeover by the Europeans is going to lead to some wars. And the very first worldwide war should be considered the 7 Years' War, right? Now, we call World War I the Great War at first, and then it was eventually called the World War I when World War II occurred, right? So now the British are going to take Canada from France after this war, well, the eastern half of it anyway. And then the Treaty of Paris is going to eventually end the conflict and put the French on the opposite side of the Mississippi River, right? So the British are going to take this land from Canada, and so also the France are going to, jot this down, this is very important to you, because of this war, the French lost the Louisiana territory and had to give it to the Spanish. That's why the French Quarter in New Orleans has so much Spanish architecture, right? Because it actually belonged to the Spanish from the years of, I think, 1762 or 63, all the way up till 1803, right? So, excuse me. Now, anyway, the fighting is going to break out everywhere. The Treaty of Paris is going to be the thing that actually brings it to an end. And now we got one more little bit of stuff to talk about. We have to talk about this new trade, right? Because right now, as we've been talking this entire time, I've been alluding to the fact that economies have now gone global, right? Economies have now gone huge. Economies have now stretching continents and oceans, and now everyone's funds and colonies are starting to overlap, and there's wars going on about them. But we do need to talk about how that simple economy functioned, right? The global economy, a lot of people have referred to it as like the triangular trade, was a three-legged trade network that ran from Europe to Africa to North America and back to Europe again. And now I'm very well aware that there were probably some shipments going from Europe and back to North America, and North America back to Africa. But it's this main area of the world saw the heaviest movement of goods, right? And we usually break it down and refer to it as the triangle trade, right? Now, the triangle trade is very simple. It only has 3 legs, much like, of course, a triangle, right? So they're going to start shipping people, unfortunately, because that's where the slave trade is going to get kicked up, and also goods, right? So the first leg of the triangular trade was merchant ships are going to bring goods from Europe to Africa, right? These big goods include things like guns, cloths, textiles, cash, processed materials. That's what you put a star and put processed goods. Now, these are going to be traded to Africans for the exchange of other Africans, right? So usually on coastal shore port towns, right? The second leg, also known as the Middle Passage, was after the exchange of some of these processed goods that were also going to be heading to the colonies for slaves, which are going to be picked up on the coasts of Africa, all right, on the coasts, write that down somewhere, the coasts of Africa, an underlined coast, and slaves are going to be transported to the Americas from Africa, right? Slaves were picked up at forts along the African, or like forts in Africa along the coast, all right? So, and slaves were transported on large slave vessels, usually at around 500 occupancy per vessel, right? So, and then the third leg is going to bring raw materials, jot that down, raw materials like sugar, molasses, cotton, rum, tobacco, and other plantation products back to Europe, right? Where those goods would then be processed, and then the entire cycle starts all over again. All right, so, and we will explain this a little bit more tomorrow, but that's what it looks like in a total. And then positives of this, of course, are going to be you're going to make a ton of money from the triangular trade. Cultural diffusion is going to be huge. International relations are going to progress forward. It's going to help establish new countries, settlements, and also write down underneath this as well, the growth of colonies into cities, right? That's huge. Negatives, on the other hand, though, ships could be lost at sea. It increased the ideas of slavery and its profitability, and also promoted racism as well, all right? So we're going to stop right there, and then we're going to talk about the rest of the stuff tomorrow. Hope you all guys have a great evening. I'll see y'all later.